This video will be concerning firearms, specifically shotguns or other smoothbore firearms, and it will concern itself with the standards for the dimensions of the cartridges and touch on parameters and slop factor for that, as well as the chambering that they go into and the caliber, gauge, or millimeter rating for the bore or the barrel. Gauge, caliber, millimeter for SAAMI shotgun or shot shell drawings in the PDF page 26 through 39 and page 395. These are published standards about this. Warning, there's going to be a roundabout Wikipedia at the end of the video. First of all, the gauge, caliber, and millimeter rating. The gauge number here is an absolute rounded off number, except in the case of 410, which is a special case. And the SAMI article and pages list the wrong bore diameter if you do the calculation. They're listing the minimum bore or minimum diameter for the inside of the barrel that's acceptable or tolerable, minimum tolerance. If you're not aware of it, shotgun shells especially, and in fact some other types of cartridges, have a major slop factor issue. You're allowed to get away with doing all sorts of things in a shotgun, not only because it's a shotgun and it doesn't have to have a really tight bore or anything really tightly, standardized, but because they've never been that way. The actual calculation is supposed to be 72.9 caliber or 0.729 inches. This one's listing 725. That's just the minimum. They include a plus or minus factor after it. And that's normal. It's not supposed to be so tight that it would cause an obstruction or cause danger to the user. SAMI only is recognizing currently 10 gauge, 12 gauge, 16 gauge, 20 gauge, 28 gauge, and 410. 410 is very unusual because its minimum bore diameter is literally listed as 41 caliber, and it has the correct millimeter rating at 10.41. Which makes it easy to remember. And all of these are approximately correct as far as the chamber dimensions. But these are, if you're not aware of it, sometimes maximum dimensions or minimum dimensions. The accepted dimensions are based on which one of those sets works best. There's something called the delta L problem. It doesn't apply to shotgun shells, but it does apply in some cases based on older or newer shotguns not being tolerant. It should be pointed out that the error of the length of a shotgun shell can be wrong and be acceptable by CIP, which is the French version of SAMI, and SAMI, by being wrong by up to half a centimeter sometimes, depending on which shell you're looking at. Now we're going to go on to CIP. CIP and SAMI do not agree and don't have to. In the case of SAMI, our example for 12 gauge is way off. It's down to 71 caliber instead of 72 point something or 73 like it's supposed to be. Now that's from them rounding down to the nearest tenth of a millimeter, apparently. The rest of the chamber information and or cartridge dimension is about right. We'll do 20.2 here. Again, are they rounding up or down for the neck diameter? Now we go up here. Here's a 12 gauge neck diameter, 20.24. So it looks like they're rounding down to the next 10th millimeter and calling it good. Okay. In fact, they mention that not on all the pages. There's an individual page for each one on SAMI. But they do mention it in French a couple of times on some other pages. Okay. They also include a broader range, because in the European Union you can still find 4 gauge, 8 gauge, and other gauges, including my personal new favorite, the 32 gauge, which is exactly 50 caliber. In the United States, that's very significant because being exactly 50 caliber, depending on how much sandpaper you use or how much buildup in the barrel, you could be breaking a law. Isn't that lovely? So anyway, let's move on. The industrial shotgun bore diameter is listed at 83 caliber. The normal shotgun, yes, CIP lists it, both of them, is approximately 82 caliber. And 4 gauge lists the wrong caliber at 92 caliber. It is not. It's a 105 caliber damn gun. Why is CIP listing it? Because that's one of the minimum bore diameters for a flare gun. That's right, CIP does not refer to a shotgun shell in any way here. They're referring to an adopted standard for the only use 4-gauge shells have anymore, flare guns. Now let's look at that with SAMI standards. Oh wait, they don't list 4-gauge because nobody uses it for anything anymore. And again, 410, oh wait a minute, they're using the minimum bore diameter, unlike SAMI that never did that, and it's listing at 40 caliber. Anyway, but yeah, 40 caliber, 50 caliber, we can have just a few guns here, by the way, if you're not noticing that. They can be 40 caliber, 50 caliber and a half, 60, 60 and a half, 70 and a half, and 70 caliber. We can have rounded numbers. Yay! No, we don't have that. So let's move on. DaveCushman.net. This is just a random guy. He was also a beekeeper, which is kind of cool, but he was also into guns, and he went through and measured cartridges and became a source that was at one time cited on Wikipedia. And here's his page. And you notice, again, for the 4-gauge, he has the wrong bore diameter. The rest of them are fine. But for some reason, he's listing, again, if you're not aware of it, a flare gun bore diameter. Now, that's showing 935. Again, a lot of this I had to derive myself by coming up with the numbers. Why is it different from the 92 up here? Well, one of them is a flare cartridge that was exclusively in the United States. Dave is in Britain. The flare cartridge in the CIP thing versus Dave. Dave apparently got a hold of a flare cartridge from the United States. Olin flare cartridges are very much not 4-gauge. And again, it's a flare gun cartridge. I don't know why in Britain he got this, but that's what he measured. Yeah, he measured a flare gun apparently. Anyway, the cartridge dimensions at 1035. He does nothing but inches, and he's in Britain. And this was back when they were doing the transition to metric a long time before, so don't understand. Anyway, he at least gets the bore diameter for 12-gauge exactly spot on. Okay, let's move on. Oldmunition.org. It's a It's a Spanish-speaking version of the site that uses CIP standards, and it has all the information filled in. Now, you may have noticed something I'm emphasizing and harping on here. They consistently list the information, at least trying to be accurate. In the case of 4-gauge shells or 8-gauge shells, there's a reason they would get things wrong because some of the 8-gauge shells are industrial only. They're a smaller bore or a different bore. Some of them are flare gun only, so that's what they have. Some of the dimensions, if you're not aware of it, were actually extracted from grenade launchers, which are not shotguns. But that's what was being available at the time. This one has the cartridge maximums listed. And I want to point out something that some of you might have noticed before, but I went past on purpose. Dave Cushman is not listing the cartridge dimensions. He's listing the chamber dimensions because he was interested in fixing firearms. He listed the chamber diameters, so the numbers aren't supposed to match. They're supposed to be slightly larger than the cartridge dimensions. And everybody switches back and forth between millimeter and inch, and that causes accumulation of errors as well. Okay, now we're going to get to the subject of the rant for the video today. Wikifuckinpedia. So anyway, this is the Wikipedia fail page group. Wikipedia shotgun cartridges and bore dimensions and also chamber dimensions, but I'm not going to bring that up. Collated and collected from random articles all over the spectrum into one table. And you may have noticed something very different. Now let's compare and contrast. This is Wikipedia's way of collecting information. This is literally oldmunition.org, a Spanish website trying to sort this out without killing anybody by having their gun blown up. This is Dave Cushman doing his best in Britain and getting it mostly right, except for just 2 bores that nobody uses. And here's CIP using, again, standards. And here's Sammy throwing out everything that isn't used very often and getting it very close to correct. And if anything, trying to make them safer and trying to make it to where you have the standards made to where you make the fewest mistakes and damage the fewest things. And then we get Wikipedia. God awful. First of all, you notice the lack of data. Next, we have the 2-gauge barrel, which isn't listed by anybody. Nobody asked for that. Here's the 4-gauge barrel. According to the article listed of bore and gauge comparison, under rifle cartridges, and it gets it correct. That's, if you're not aware of it, 105 caliber or 1.05 inches is really 4 gauge. That's literally the inside of a water pipe. I'm not kidding. That's a 1-inch Schedule 40 pipe. That's what 4 gauges are based on. Someone grabbed a 1-inch goddamn Schedule 40 pipe and made a barrel. That's literally where the standard comes from. I'm not kidding. That's the origin story for 4 gauge. It's a hunk of water pipe from the hardware store. That's how they were invented. I'm not exaggerating. But then, oh God, Wikipedia lists on a rifle page not only the wrong bore, but a very, very wrong bore, 1 inch exactly. Why? Because again, that's the Orion 25 millimeter flare gun barrel. Again? But anyway, for the rifle cartridge, which they got almost as wrong, at least we have the rim and stuff. But for this one, with the correct bore diameter, it never lists any of the characteristics of any of the cartridges. Because again, we haven't used 4 gauges for a long time. There are very few examples, almost no guns. And yeah, you can throw a flare cartridge in them. That demilitarizes them. But for some reason, Wikipedia has to include dead-ass accurate 132 caliber goddamn 2 gauge shotguns that are used for taking out entire flocks of geese. And accurately, or somewhat accurately, the Orion flare gun bore, and then this for 4 gauge. Okay, now we have 6 gauge. Okay, if you're not aware of it, no, I couldn't find an explanation anywhere in Wikipedia why they included the 6 gauge. Even the person who started it did it because he found it someplace. That's not even listed on CIP, and CIP lists gauges for guns that there are no examples of. Then we get to the 8 gauge. Oh my God. Well, first of all, it starts off with the industrial shotgun, the slug gun industrial standard, which CIP recognizes. And then it goes on about the shotgun barrel. And then it goes on about a seismic thunder gun, otherwise known as the quake gun. Literally, it's called the quake gun. It's called the Betsy. Okay. I loved making that video. But anyway, let's look at the 12 gauge. The most common shotgun chambering on Earth is not listed on Wikipedia. Nor is 10 gauge, which is at least more common than a 6 gauge. 16 gauge is very common. It really is in America and in Europe. They list the 20 gauge, and you know what? The only reason it has accurate information, I'm the one who fixed it. They don't list the 24 gauge, the 28 gauge, and the 32 gauge may or may not be accurate here. It's accurate. The CIP standard makes it a 50 cal on the mark for a good reason. And the 410 article, which there is one, is also accurate. I didn't have to fix it. The only reason it's accurate? A bunch of people showed up and fixed it, complaining about how inaccurate Wikipedia is. So let's review. This is how Wikipedia covers a subject. With silence. And errors. And multiple errors. This is how munition.org did in Spain. This is how it's done by Dave Cushman, which only has 2 errors and is much more valuable than any other listing. And this one here is CIP, which spreads it out over multiple pages. Here is your freaking cross-reference. Why aren't you just using one of these? This is literally, it's 400 bytes of data or something small like that. And it's still wrong. And wrong. And okay, that one's right. Well, no, that's still wrong. It's supposed to be 835 CIP. And then we get SAMI, which only lists the ones that are in use because the companies that make the guns tell them. Further reading down here, there's also a link in the article here if you want to, and also on the Wikipedia page, obviously on this YouTube channel, for caliber to gauge and gauge to caliber conversion, and links to oldmunicon.org, or munition, davecushman.net, CIP, BobP.org, which is what it's called, SAMI shot shell drawing PDF, and all the Wikipedia pages you can barf on. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. This has been a rant with waptek about standards that aren't, and data sources that are incomplete, seemingly on purpose to just aggravate me.